Right. Okay, it's 2-1 here in Illinois, so I think we should get started so we have time to hear Chris's presentation and then time for questions and hopefully answers. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. My name is Olga Makarova. I'm a reference librarian at the Slavic Reference Service at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And Slavic Reference Service, together with the Language Workshop at Indiana University, collaborating to host this online discussion series on research and language learning. We are starting with Turkic languages first. It's our goal to host 2 discussions this fall, and this is our second discussion of the semester, and then 2 more in the spring next year. We're inviting established scholars and students to discuss the role language proficiency plays in conducting research, and especially using examples of published scholarly works or ongoing research projects. And it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Kristoffer Rees, who is going to talk about his experience and his expertise working with the Kazakh language. Dr. Rees is an associate professor of political science at Indiana University East. He holds an MA degree in Central Eurasian Studies and a PhD in political science and Central Eurasian Studies, both from Indiana University. He is author of numerous publications, journal articles, conference presentations on the topics of nationalism, multiculturalism and identity politics, memory politics, language politics, political conflict and protest, post-Soviet regime transition, I can't speak today, I'm sorry, and Central Asia. He teaches courses in comparative politics and political theory. He's passionate about global competence and critical literacy, and we're very happy and grateful that Dr. Rees was able to join us today, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
All righty, well, first of all, I guess welcome to our conversation, and thank you very much for everyone who's here, and thank you to everybody at UIUC and at IU that has worked to host me today. And I guess as was just announced, I've been asked to talk about how I've used Kazakh in my academic career, and I guess I'm glad to be here virtually to share my experiences with you. And when I was thinking about kind of how to put this together, because I've never really thought about my sort of different research products and the different ways that I've used Kazakh in the different research and other projects that I've done, never really thought about them sort of holistically and thought about how they kind of go together with one another. So the best that I could come up with was to kind of tell you a few stories about me and my experiences that I think and I hope will highlight what I see as the criticality of Kazakh for my research. And then I would argue, or I would hope that it argues, or I hope that I show that through the study of Kazakh, I'll demonstrate how the study of the peoples, the cultures, the history, and the politics of Eurasia can really only be done successfully with a solid grasp of those, and I couldn't think of a better term, of the national languages, the Turkic languages in the 5 republics of sort of Central Asia, sort of complementing Russian. And I have not just a title slide. So my name is Kristoffer Rees, and as was mentioned, I'm an associate professor of political science at Indiana University East. And IU East is one of the regional campuses of the Indiana University system. So it's generally teaching focused in contrast to the more research oriented Bloomington or Indianapolis campuses. But as was highlighted, I do maintain a reasonably active research agenda that absolutely relies on my study of and sort of the knowledge of Kazakh that I do have. And before I go too much further, I have 10 years of teaching evaluations that remind me that I tend to start talking very, very, very quickly. And if that happens, just send a quick message in the chat, or otherwise alert me to the fact that I'm going way too fast, and I will do my best to slow down. But I do want to share a little bit how I settled into pursuing a research agenda that primarily is grounded and anchored in Kazakhstan and focuses on kind of understanding the politics, cultures, and peoples of Kazakhstan. Talk about my pathway to that trajectory, and to talk about my pathway to study in Kazakh, and to discuss some of the resources that I've been able to leverage to facilitate my study of Kazakh, both I guess at IU Bloomington, in Kazakhstan, and then what I've done since I started the tenure track position at IU East. And to step back quite a few years, the first major experience that set me on my professional trajectory was serving in the Peace Corps in Kyrgyzstan from 2002 to 2004. And this was the first thing that I did after graduating from college with an undergraduate degree in psychology. And so I kind of didn't really know a whole lot. Before I left for Kyrgyzstan in fall of 2002, I had no prior experience with any Turkic language, had no prior experience with Russian, and really had no prior experience with Central Eurasia more broadly. In Kyrgyzstan, I spent the first 3 months learning Kyrgyz with the other volunteers. About half of the volunteers were trained in Russian, half in Kyrgyz, and in part because of language challenges, right? You leave the hotel and you can't really talk to anybody. It was really early on in that experience in Kyrgyzstan, way back in like 2002 and early 2003, that I became interested in the questions of identity, of nationalism, and this broader context of post-Soviet transition that I would argue really continues to guide my research and my kind of interests today. And what I remember, and as I said, I'm mostly going to be telling you stories today. What I remember is during our first couple of weeks, the first couple of weeks of training took place at a state-run hotel, and the grounds of that hotel were used by shepherds for grazing livestock. And we were encouraged by our language instructors, who are all Kyrgyz nationals, to practice the language as much as possible. And their idea, of course, being that we would maybe practice with the other Peace Corps volunteers, the hotel staff, maybe the other language instructors, kind of missing that whole point. With about maybe 10 words of Kyrgyz at hand, I kind of proudly and confidently marched up to one of the shepherds that was passing through to announce, "Hi, my name is Chris." Right, and my language instructor came running after me to kind of explain, "Oh, no, he doesn't understand you. He's Tatar." And then he, smoothed things over with the very puzzled shepherd. And I think in this kind of one little interaction sort of exposed me to the language politics of the region and to the multinational nature of the populations of Central Asia, which were issues that I remained curious about throughout my time in Kyrgyzstan. And that was 2002 to 2004 as a Peace Corps volunteer. And then about 2 years, year and a half afterwards, I worked in Bishkek. And I saw a hand, which maybe means I was going too quickly. And anyway, the issues that kind of that first interaction with just a few weeks in the country showed me really kind of piqued my interest, and were ideas that I continued to kind of be alert for and sort of observant of as I taught English as a Peace Corps volunteer and worked in a university post-Peace Corps service. And the exposure to those issues kind of firsthand and really mediated through the Kyrgyz language influenced my decision to pursue the master's degree in Central Eurasian Studies at IU Bloomington after I completed my Peace Corps service. So in 2006, I began the MA program in SUS, Central Eurasian Studies, and I started out of sequence in the spring semester and was very dismayed to learn that Kyrgyz wasn't in the plans to be offered by the university anytime soon. And I think they do offer it now, but in 2002, 2003, 2006, they did not. And I had part of the reason for wanting to pursue the graduate degree was that I wanted to formalize my knowledge of the language, which aside from those 3 months of very intensive training at the very start of my service, was largely acquired through practical experience. All right, I didn't have kind of rigorous training in the grammar, didn't have rigorous training in sort of reading literature, reading newspapers. Even at the end of Peace Corps service, we did an oral proficiency test and I scored very highly, but I still couldn't read a newspaper article. And so these were the kinds of things that I was trying to, I guess I wanted to rectify by pursuing the degree in SUS. Anyway, in that first spring semester, I took the second semester of the Russian for graduate students sequence that was offered at Bloomington. And this was perfect for building out my Russian knowledge because it gave me the formal background to consolidate basically what was about a first year, maybe kind of first semester of the second year of Russian that I acquired through self-study, some occasional tutoring, and a lot of sort of direct Russian language exposure in Kyrgyzstan. So to make a long story shorter, I was advised by Professor William Fearman, who's, was at SUS for a very long time, and he's an emeritus professor now, but he ended up being my MA thesis chair. He advised me to take Kazakh in the fall semester, since it was similar to Kyrgyz, and because he thought, and I think very, very wisely thought that it might help me gain a broader familiarity with issues of identity politics across Eurasia to really help me better understand the consequences of that Soviet legacy versus what to that point had, maybe not necessarily intentionally, but had kind of been a hyper focus on the country that I had lived in and worked in, so Kyrgyzstan. I started in intermediate Kazakh in the fall semester and then was promoted to the second semester of advanced Kazakh for the spring semester. And it was in that second semester course where we read, there's no textbook for learning advanced Kazakh, and there are very few for learning introductory and intermediate Kazakh for English language speakers. So in that second semester course, what we did is we read excerpts from Kazakh literature, excerpts from Kazakh history texts, and contemporary news articles. So kind of we read what was available to us through the IU library and through online media sources. And so it was through the Kazakh language, because I'd taken a week-long trip to Almaty as a Peace Corps volunteer to kind of check it out. But it was really through the Kazakh language that I became, pretty deeply familiar with Kazakh history and culture. And I wouldn't say that I, learned everything there was to know in a single semester, but rather that being introduced to the country and its peoples through Kazakh and under the guidance of our Kazakh teacher, herself from Kazakhstan, gave me a more intimate and engaging perspective that I otherwise wouldn't have gotten from materials that were mediated through English or Russian. Let's see. So in summer of 2008, I was awarded a fellowship by ACTR, so American Councils, to study Kazakh intensively in Almaty. And this 2-month program was my first extended time in Kazakhstan, aside from that week as a Peace Corps volunteer where a couple of volunteers and I went on vacation to go skiing. So it wasn't really very intensive experience. This 2-month program in 2008 was my first extended time in Kazakhstan, and it helped me transform my research interests from vaguely about the relationships between political power, national identity, and language use in Kyrgyzstan, as colored by my experiences as a Peace Corps volunteer, and as colored by someone that was living and working in Bishkek during the 2005 Tulip Revolution, sort of transformed my agenda from kind of I want to understand these experiences that I've had, rather to wanting to understand more broadly the interrelationships among identity change and political transition in post-Soviet Central Eurasia a little bit more broadly. And by the end of that summer, it seemed like the knowledge of Kyrgyz that I had, plus the knowledge of Kazakh that I was gaining, was just what I needed to be able to engage with and answer my questions of interest. And after completing the MA in SUS in 2008, I continued, of course, after applying and being accepted, of course, I continued at IU Bloomington as a PhD student in the political science program. As a political science PhD student, I continued advanced study of Kazakh. I had a FLAS fellowship for 2008, 2009, I think. For the PhD training, I really leaned in more heavily to the disciplinary and methodological training of a political scientist, since I'd kind of come into the graduate program without a strong background in political science as such. So it was an opportunity to transition my social science background as a psychology undergraduate major and my area studies background as a SUS MA degree holder to an actual political scientist. Now that I've introduced just, I guess, a little bit about myself, and to an extent talked about what motivated my language study, I just want to give a very brief overview of some of the things that I hope to address throughout the rest of my talk. First, I want to describe the kinds of research questions and research methods that I generally use in my research to illustrate how critical language study has been for advancing my research capacity, and especially for thinking about how important Kazakh language study in particular has been. Second, I'll spend some time discussing some of my publications and media appearances that I'm most proud of and which maybe best illustrate how I've used my knowledge of Kazakh to fulfill my research ambitions across a variety of contexts. Third, I want to spend a little bit of time reflecting on how Kazakh language proficiency has advanced my thinking, my integration with the field, my network, and etc. Thinking about the utility of language study beyond just formal research outputs, but more holistically thinking about how some capacity in Kazakh has what that has done in terms of shaping how I present myself professionally and my professional trajectory more specifically. And I don't think we actually will get to the I guess penultimate 2 slides just based on timing. But since I do work at a teaching-centric institution, I'll highlight here that I do think it would be remiss not to briefly address the intersections of language study and language proficiency, my research, and then teaching more broadly, since teaching is the core of what I do. And then I'll conclude maybe with some key takeaways from my reflection today before we move on to questions. So as I alluded to when I was introducing myself, my questions of interest center on identity and understanding how identity is internalized and expressed and how that expression has changed over time. And as a political scientist, I'm especially interested in the relationships that people form with the state and the extent to which the state has capacity to shape the way that individual and collective identities are understood and constructed. And so while I'm on the one hand a comparative political scientist by training, I'm also very much steeped in the area studies tradition, and thus my expertise and my fieldwork are regionally bounded. So rather than searching for big generalizabilities that maybe explain trends in the political world at large, I focus intensively on maybe what are maybe littler questions, but I would say that these are probably single puzzle pieces towards understanding that bigger political world. And then, of course, given my focus on Kazakhstan, this more intensive focus is particularly facilitated by knowledge of Kazakh. And here on this slide, I found 2 images that I think sum up the 2 major directions of my scholarly outputs. And again, these are all very heavily informed by Kazakh knowledge. The billboard that you see below, I guess on the lower left, is from 2012, and it's a state-produced, so an officially produced get out the vote message for what were upcoming parliamentary elections. I guess the billboard's probably from December 2011. And it says that it's important for you, it's important for your country. And what we see are 7 people wearing different ethno-national costumes, representing some of the different ethno-national groups that make up the population of the country. It's kind of a visual representation of how the Kazakhstani state has, since 1991, pursued, at least to an extent, has pursued an officially inclusive national identities policy that seeks to forge some kind of common national identity out of the ethnic Kazakhs, the ethnic Russians, ethnic Uzbeks, ethnic Koreans, ethnic Tatars, ethnic Ukrainians, ethnic Turkmen, and so on and so forth, that constitute the population of the republic. But on the other hand, since independence in 1991, the population has very much tipped in favor of an ethnic Kazakh majority. So it's gone from about 40% ethnic Kazakh in 1989 to about 70% ethnic Kazakh today. So I'm interested in how meaningful these efforts of the Kazakhstani state are at presenting this kind of common home idea, and to what extent the rhetoric that informs visuals like we see here, what extent that rhetoric hides a much more ethno-nationally Kazakh forward kind of ambition of the state. And there isn't a clear answer, and it hasn't been a single sustained trajectory since 1991. So there's, a lot of scholarship on the theme, not just my own. But here, having studied Kazakh gives some insights into the tension between civic national and ethno-national nation-building processes, right? If we look at the billboard, it's bilingual, Kazakh on the left and Russian on the right. In Kazakh, it says Yelin Ushun Mangansты, or important for your yell. And I'm not translating that because it is kind of an ambiguous concept that, depending on context, it might mean country, it might mean people, it might mean nation. Whereas the Russian side says Важно для тебя, важно для страны, which is, it's much less ambiguously important for your country. And these kinds of tensions and these kind of differences in how language is used and what meanings are encoded in Kazakh versus Russian language presentations are I guess, inherently interesting to me. And of course, being language-based, of course, they're supported in really things that I can only pursue because I've studied both languages to an extent. The other major direction of my research focus remains centered on how identity is framed and constituted and how identity evolves, but it examines the way that the Kazakhstani state has reconciled and incorporated the Soviet experience into official national narratives. So, in other words, the kind of big question that I'm trying to get at with this second trajectory of my research is, where does being Soviet or having been Soviet fit into the new histories of a newly sovereign country that didn't necessarily have a cohesive nation-state unit prior to colonization by the Russian Empire in the 18th century, or even before? In investigating this, I'm interested in history, and in particular, how history is instrumentalized by the Kazakhstani state in pursuit of its collective identity-making goals. In particular, or I guess I already said that, we see this well illustrated in the graphic here. And this is a graphic produced by a well-known Kazakh illustrator in commemoration of Defenders of the Fatherland Day. And so we see ostensibly Kazakh military prowess, or Kazakhstani military prowess, across the centuries combined into one celebration and kind of this one patriotic expression. And while there's an emphasis on ethnic Kazakhs, in the back we see representatives of various peoples that lived on the Kazakh steppe centuries ago. In the middle row, we see Alia Moldagulova, an ethnic Kazakh sniper who fought in the Red Army in World War II, standing next to a member of the Alash Orda, which was a pro-independence anti-Soviet movement led by Kazakhs in the 1920s in what's now Kazakhstan. And then finally, in the front, we see a soldier wearing the uniform of the contemporary Kazakh army. And what's interesting here, and what is kind of a theme that I've generally tried to pursue, is the effort to incorporate the Soviet experience into this long-term national history by celebrating these Kazakhstani Soviet heroes rather than kind of eliding them from that longer historical narrative as I might have assumed or expected. So to talk about the research methods that I use a little bit, I primarily rely on kind of qualitative interpretive methods. And in part, this is because of my area studies background. And again, because of my area studies background, I'm not an especially rigid methodologist. And I'm more so rely on the interpretive frames that I've developed through years of studying Kazakh and years of studying Russian, years of studying Kazakhstani and Eurasian politics and Kazakhstani cultures, of course, in conjunction with the on-the-ground, in-country field work that is comprised of interviews, ethnographic and autoethnographic observations, and consuming mass media, right? Reading Kazakh press in Kazakh and in Russian. And I've also done some more collaborative survey-based research, which I'll talk about shortly. And I have a couple of pictures here that kind of illustrate two facets of my research approach, or my methodological approach. First is a picture that I took at the World War II monument in Karaganda that I had gone as part of kind of a countrywide tour with one of my colleagues, visiting the World War II monuments and the World War II squares in the big cities of Kazakhstan. And here you see a young mother kneeling with her child at the memorial, and I just kind of happened upon it and quickly took a picture. And here, kind of observing how people interact with these sites of public memory, I think helps show the role that these sites, both the Soviet era sites that have been rehabilitated in independent Kazakhstan, as well as new parks commemorating the victory in World War II. It shows the role that these sites play in advancing and reinforcing specific ways of thinking about collective historical memory. And while those kinds of observations, how do people interact with monuments, those are kind of language agnostic. I also rely on individual and group interviews that I've arranged and conducted to provide much more so the content that informs my research. In the second picture on the right, you can see me with Bayan Moldagulova. She's the closest living relative of one of the Soviet Kazakh soldiers whose legacy is valorized in independent Kazakhstan. And so here, to conduct these interviews, my language skills are indispensable, and not just in gaining access to people to talk to, but also in building trust with them. And the interview that I conducted with Bayan is probably the single thing that I've done that I'm the most proud of in terms of conducting research in Kazakhstan. So let me tell you another story. Let me tell you how I came about this interview. In 2017, I was awarded a 3-month research and language training fellowship by American councils to study Russian in Astana and to pursue interviews with key informants in Astana, Almaty, and Aktobe concerning the commemorations of and monument sites dedicated to the memory of hero of the Soviet Union, Alia Moldagulova. And I should mention here that beginning with my Peace Corps training in 2002, my language study had always favored the national languages, so Kyrgyz and Kazakh, at the expense of developing substantial proficiency and really confidence in Russian. When I was in Kyrgyzstan, I studied off and on over the 3 years that I lived in the country, up to, as I said, about maybe the first year of college level proficiency. And with knowledge of Kyrgyz and knowledge of Kazakh that I'd gained at IU Bloomington, plus what by then was probably intermediate high level reading knowledge, but no real functional communicative ability that I cultivated in that first semester of graduate study at IU, I was generally able to accomplish everything that I wanted to do in country, in Kyrgyzstan or in Kazakhstan. And in terms of reading Russian language news, Russian language publications, was able to do that. But particularly, because I had this fellowship in 2017, particularly as I advanced in my position at IU East and kind of started scraping my research agenda dry in terms of what I was able to do, it became apparent that I needed to be a whole lot more confident in speaking and listening to Russian to take my research agenda to the next level. So that's how I ended up in Astana in 2017 with the goal and with funding to pursue advanced Russian language training. And that's because, in part, because my Kazakh was already very good. And I think that helped my application for the fellowship stand out, because I wasn't going to be introduced to Kazakhstan or the country, but was going to build on that experience and that expertise that I already had from Kazakh knowledge. So anyway, and about a third of the way through that fellowship, and as I said, it was 3 months, maybe just a little longer, I traveled to the city of Aktobe, and that's the hometown of Alia Moldagulova, the Soviet era hero whose story I was trying to learn more about. And while I was in Aktobe, I came across an article published in Russian by the Kazakhstani branch of Sputnik News, of all things, that had interviewed Bayan Moldagulova, her cousin, in the context of at the time the article was written, and this was just prior to Victory Day, so just prior to maybe late April, the Victory Day celebrations. They'd interviewed Bayan about her cousin's life and her experiences and how she worked to keep the memory of her cousin who fought and died in World War II and then subsequently was made a national hero in Kazakhstan. This article was written in Russian by a reporter with a Slavic name. It suggested that Russian would need to be the initial mode of communication. At this point, after a little bit of training in country, I felt a little bit more confident about my capacity in Russian. And so I emailed the author using the contact information on the article to ask if they could provide any contact information for Bayan. I crossed my fingers, I sent the message. I really didn't expect any kind of reply, right? Hi, I'm a random stranger. My Russian's not super great. Can you give me some information about somebody that you've interviewed? But about 3 weeks later, I was really, really surprised. I got to my email, a 1-sentence reply to the effect of, and I don't remember exactly, but basically, here's the phone number I have for, I don't have anything else to share. And I was like, okay, that's great. And again, I really do want to stress that I'm certainly not fluent in Russian by any stretch. I'm not fluent in Kazakh by any stretch. And phone calls are probably the most anxiety-inducing task for me in any language: English, Kazakh, Russian, really any language. So I steeled my nerves, took a few deep breaths, and I finally called the phone number. And this, of course, connected directly to Bayan. So I explained myself, again, as best as I could, and asked if she'd be willing to meet with me for an interview. And she agreed, setting the time and the location. And I, didn't really feel like I had much credibility to say what you've proposed is actually super inconvenient, and I just made it work. So I met her a few days later at the cafe that she chose, where she was waiting for me, and the interview started off really shaky. She was clearly just kind of anxious, kind of on edge. She was one of the maybe the only, but one of the only interviewees that I've ever worked with in Kazakhstan, and I've interviewed by now probably 50, 75 people across the last 10 years or so, was one of the only ones who denied my request to record the interview, right? Sort of, I was like, so can I record? And it's like, absolutely not, no. Like, okay. And her first question to me was really, and I remember it because it just kind of shook me, was a very icy, like, what do you want? And this, of course, didn't really facilitate my transition to very smooth delivery of the questions that I'd rehearsed and really practiced, but not having any other options at that point. I plodded ahead, and while the interview was in Russian, since that was the language that we'd established as language of communication from the first phone call, when I'm in Kazakhstan and when I stumble in trying to find words in Russian, which happens a lot, I often try the Kazakh word, right? And depending on the audience, because they probably will understand it. And sometimes it's on purpose, and sometimes it's just kind of a nervous response when I'm just kind of overwhelmed. But this worked in my favor here, and I don't remember what I was trying to ask, but she reacted when I kind of slipped into mumbling Kazakh to myself to ask if I knew Kazakh, and I said, well, maybe a little bit. And this was, her first step in kind of visibly relaxing and kind of sort of realizing that, kind of I might speak really awkwardly, but I'm trying to kind of know what I'm doing a little bit. Anyway, so the rest of the interview went for maybe 30 or 45 more minutes. And she was very friendly. She shared with me original documents that she had. She brought some letters and other things. And I was able to photograph those to keep my own record to then read and think about later. And as you can see, the interview concluded with her asking to take a picture with me to kind of document the experience. And I've been in touch with her since on WhatsApp. I sent her a link to the article about her cousin when it was finally published and that kind of stuff. So, and really from my side, the interview was one of a kind. So her parents had actually been responsible for raising Alia, the Soviet hero that I was interested in learning more about, for some part of her life. So although their lives never crossed, she was able to provide a more extended and more nuanced portrait of Alia, and probably even more importantly, for what I was interested in, was able to describe the different ways in which her family was and was not consulted in official monuments and commemorations. And that's information that I never would have gotten from anywhere else. And I highlight the interview, not just because I was really proud, I am really proud of myself, but I highlight because I think it illustrates the way that even limited facility in Kazakh serves to change the dynamics at work in interactions with informants, right? So even though the majority of the interview was conducted in Russian, and it was conducted by me, an obvious foreigner, obviously a non-native speaker, acknowledging the presence and importance of Kazakh language helped put my informants at ease. And I think it helped me elicit more discussion than I really otherwise would have been able to do. So that's a lot, but just thinking about Kazakh language and my research, I want to go over, like I said, a few of the things that I'm most proud of. And I guess I'm not sure I would say that I'm proud of my dissertation, but I got it done, and it's a big scholarly effort. And I drew 2 articles out of my dissertation, which I'll talk about briefly. And then I'll speak a little bit more about my post-dissertation trajectory, which is the article about Soviet heroes in independent Kazakhstan that I've talked about already, and as well as a book chapter in an edited volume that's forthcoming very soon. And then I'll talk just a little bit about the few avenues of public-facing scholarship that I've engaged in. So the title of my dissertation was Citizenship, Identity, Politics, and Language Choice in Kazakhstan. The goal was, and kind of as I explained earlier, the goal was to try to understand the nature of identity policy in post-Soviet Kazakhstan. And in particular, I wanted to investigate the role of what's called the Assembly of Peoples of Kazakhstan, or Assembly of People of Kazakhstan, because the name changed, in policy formulation and implementation from 1991 until 2010, 2012 or so. And then I wanted to look at the relationship that Kazakhstani citizens had towards that official discourse on identity and language, basically assessing, is Kazakhstani, this collective national identity building project, is it working, and if so, how? And then to try to use that case to tell us something about nation building more generally. So this obviously is my first big sustained scholarly output, and it followed a rather traditional structure for a dissertation. And here I would say that Kazakh and Russian language facility was especially helpful in developing the context of the Kazakhstani case. The prospectus and the literature review, as I'm sure everybody knows, are completed before any real substantial fieldwork takes place. And since what I was trying to present in the dissertation as a whole was kind of that longue durée story of people building in and across the territory of what is now independent Kazakhstan, I leaned into my Kazakh language knowledge as much as I could. And I was able to mine the remarkably vast resources in Kazakh that are held at the IU Bloomington Library. And then as I was preparing this talk, I opened my dissertation for probably the first time in 5 years, if not longer, to review the kind of case overview chapter, which examined in 30 or 40 pages, so not in intensive detail, but examined the Kazakh steppe under Russian rule up through the late Soviet era. And the library's resources let me engage with the writing of 19th century Kazakh poet and folk hero Abay Kunanbay Ulum, let me read Soviet era reports in Russian, and it let me engage with other non-English sources. And so this chapter of the dissertation was a literature review and a synthesis more than anything. And so it didn't really lead towards anything publishable, but I think it's worth mentioning because the ability to engage with Kazakh language sources, and again, I kind of refreshed myself about this chapter yesterday, makes it richer. And I would say it helps me tell a more engaging story and help me build a much stronger foundation for the empirical chapters that followed that did turn into publishable products. So the first of those is an article that was published in Nationalities Papers in 2017. And this was a more qualitative article that was based on original survey research that I did for my dissertation. And for the survey, I worked with a local public opinion research company based in Astana. I personally did not go door to door and try to interview people. But this project, to try to describe it as simply as possible, I sought to evaluate the form of Kazakhstani peoplehood that was articulated by the Assembly of People of Kazakhstan in terms of the extent to which citizens of Kazakhstan consider themselves Kazakhstani in the sense advanced by the state. So to step back a little bit, the Assembly of People of Kazakhstan is an organization headed by the president of Kazakhstan, but which kind of on paper serves to provide avenues for the representation of the different nationalities that make up the Kazakhstani population, the whole population. And if you remember, it's something like 70% ethnic Kazakh now, 15 to 20% ethnic Russian, and the balance are over 100 different ethno-national groups. So the Assembly serves as the mouthpiece for official nationalities policy in Kazakhstan. And both this kind of political organization, this sort of representative-ish assembly, and the specific policy formulations that are advanced by the Assembly are basically unique within the post-Soviet space. And that's what captured my attention. In 2010, for example, the doctrine of people's unity was set forth, which basically established the idea that Kazakhstan citizens, or I guess maybe didn't establish, introduced the idea to much debate, that Kazakhstan citizens are not a collection of various nationalities sharing lives on a single territory, So these citizens are not first and foremost Kazakhs, Russians, Uzbeks, and so forth that happen to live in Kazakhstan, but instead they're this collective Kazakhstani population. So kind of an imposition of a kind of supra-ethnic national identity category over the population. And the policy statements and the mass media discourse on these policy statements, of which there are a lot, right? This was very contested, and what ultimately was passed was watered down from the original in terms of this conception of Kazakhstani identity. But the discourse and the policy statements are all in Kazakh and in Russian. And what is discussed in Kazakh language media is not the same in theme, in tone, in direction as what's discussed in Russian language media. So without having a solid reading knowledge of the two languages, really wouldn't be able to understand what was going on. And I really wouldn't be able to use the dissertation to make any kind of original contribution, which of course is the goal. In fact, most discussions of the assembly in English up to the point that I was writing the dissertation did little more than say, here's this little understood assembly. It does something, we don't know. Whereas the article that I published, the Nationalities Papers article, it helps establish in English what the assembly is, how it works, the policy outcomes of its work. And it's, not to make too much of myself, but it's kind of become a foundational article that scholars studying national identity in Kazakhstan since tend to reference. So I'm pretty proud of that. And I want to emphasize here, and I think I do later, but I did the published version of this dissertation chapter. I extensively reworked the survey data that I'd collected and reanalyzed it with Dr. Nora Webb-Williams, who's now at UIUC, just because her background in quantitative methodology far exceeds mine. So I want to give her credit and kind of give a shout out to her here. But I want to discuss more concretely how language study helped advance the research that I conducted for this article. So I'll tell another short story. And we're, of course, running out of time, but I think it's a good story. So hold on. In 2012, I traveled to Astana, and while I was there, and so I participated in a few events that ended up really, even though this, I guess, 10 years ago now, and 3 years before my dissertation was done and 5 years before this article was published, this trip, I think it's about 2 weeks, was very helpful for my research trajectory. It was a very preliminary trip, and if I remember correctly, it was my first trip to Kazakhstan that was in any way related to dissertation fieldwork. It was a trip of about 2 weeks just to get a feel of how feasible my projects and my ideas were, right? So from Bloomington, I had the sense that, there's this question about Kazakhstani identity, but I really had no idea if it was at all meaningful on the ground. So to facilitate that trip, I relied almost exclusively on relationships that I'd established with visiting scholars from Kazakhstan that had short-term stays in Bloomington while I was a graduate student. And basically how I became familiar with these scholars was that they often participated as native speakers in the language tables, the same language tables that I was participating in to develop my Kazakh fluency. So it was working with these colleagues that in this 2 weeks, I managed to present in English at a round table of relatively high-level bureaucrats that are involved directly and indirectly in nationalities policies in Kazakhstan. I presented a discussion of basically what was the theoretical literature review of my dissertation that made an effort to frame nationalities policy in Kazakhstan in terms of a story of multicultural people building. But I fielded a few questions in the Q&A in Kazakh, much to the delight of the attendees. And this led to conversations with people closely connected to the Assembly of People of Kazakhstan, the institution of interest, including I guess, I couldn't think of the right word when I was thinking about this, but the sort of academic advisors, the professors and other academics that contribute to informing the work of the committee or the assembly. And so one of them went to their office and returned with this book, which is not, of course, showing up. There we go. Returned with this book, which is a book written in Kazakh that is really the definitive record of the ideological mission of the assembly and the record of the activities of the assembly up through 2010. It was written by its deputy chair, who is a high-level politician in the country, and it's backed up with appendices of the organizational structure and the legal basis and et cetera of the organization. And I would say there's a dissertation to be written just in this book alone, but this was given to me because I spoke Kazakh, right? So I interacted at this roundtable, demonstrated that I spoke Kazakh, and they go to their library and look, and they're like, oh yeah. And you hear them say this to themselves, like, he knows Kazakh, so he'll be able to read this, so I'm going to give it to him. And it was accessible to me afterwards because of that reading proficiency in Kazakh. And it's a book that had a press run of about 1,000 copies total. So it's not like this was something that I would have come across on my own, visiting bookstores or otherwise. So again, just to, kind of the fallout of knowing Kazakh is much broader than just being able to, pick up a newspaper and read it. But in terms of gaining access to people and gaining access to the resources that they might be able to share with you. And then secondly, on this initial state of the field trip to Kazakhstan, I presented in Kazakh, basically a version of my dissertation prospectus to the entire political science faculty and the graduate students in the political science department at Eurasian National University, which is one of the stronger universities in the country. And obviously, I worked with my colleagues in Kazakhstan beforehand to polish the language, and I read from a prepared talk, but this helped establish my credibility as a scholar of Kazakhstan, and it helped me get invaluable feedback from Kazakhstani experts who, if I'd approached them in English, wouldn't have been able to or willing to give me the same feedback. And this meeting also helped me expand my network of contacts so that when I developed the survey instrument, I had people that I could work with on the Kazakh and Russian language versions of the survey and who could administer a pilot test for me. And so again, even in 2012, my research relied on my study of Kazakh, and it set the trajectory for the research that I've sustained since. And I am past where I want to be, so I'm going to skip a slide. I'm going to go over this article and then probably open it up for questions, since I've already talked about the monuments article. The Constituting the Kazakhstani Nation, Rhetorical Transformation of National Belonging is the second published article that emerged from work that I did for my dissertation. And so if the first article was my, quote, quantitative chapter, this piece was informed by my, qualitative chapter. And it presents a two-pronged investigation into broader questions of state-framed people-making projects in Kazakhstan, looking at mass media discourse and interviews with ordinary Kazakhstanis. So basically what the article does is it presents a well-rounded appraisal of Kazakhstani identity building from the bottom up rather than from the top down. So we investigated specifically, my co-author and I investigated specifically how people engage with the official discourse rather than looking at the official discourse to get a sense of what it is supposed to do, which is kind of more what I did in the earlier paper. And when I just want to emphasize that this was a co-authored piece. I drew from the interviews that I had done, but it's complemented with a content analysis that was largely done by Dr. Burhanov. So I interviewed 37 people in 4 cities in Kazakhstan, typically open-ended interviews, or they were open-ended interviews that were typically 30 to 45 minutes. Now, to be completely transparent, a lot of the interviews were primarily in English, since many of the informants jumped, or my informants jumped at the chance to practice their English with a native speaker. But even in these interviews, I relied on being able to fall back to Kazakh or to Russian when necessary to clarify concepts and so forth. I mentioned that I'd really leaned into developing fluency in Kazakh, and in 2014, when I was conducting these interviews, knew exactly enough Russian to get through an interview and could answer no questions outside of that. But I guess there's only about 10 minutes left. So I've talked about the fellowship that I was awarded in 2017 to pursue that qualitative investigation into the collective memory of the Soviet experience. And this is kind of where my research agenda is going at the moment. And I hope to turn this into a more, I guess, in-depth investigation and make a book-length manuscript out of that. Let's see. And I guess probably conclude on this slide. In terms of just relating the work that I did for that article back to language proficiency, I'd say that this article and this line of inquiry, right, sort of I want to understand this historical context and how it's meaningful today. I think it at least as much as, and I would say even more so than the formal semi-structured interview research that I've done, relies on language competency, and it relies on the cultural familiarity that comes from language study. I reflected on the work that I did for the Monuments article as I was preparing my talk for today, and I was thinking about how so much of the article and the information that I gathered, right, like collecting these books, interviewing these informants, seems to rely on luck, right? Being in the right place at the right time. But I thought about it more. And aside from the curiosity that was piqued by walking by this statue in the middle dozens of times in Almaty, and my mind just being, I got, blown when I learned that it was installed in 1997 and not during the late Soviet period, as I assumed, right? I was like, oh, look, Soviet heroes. So learning that it was something that was put up after independence was what inspired the question in me. But the people that I've met, and then events that I've been able to attend, such as here, 2017 high school performance dedicated to Victory Day and to celebrating the contributions of Kazakh to that Soviet victory in World War II. These are all things that have directly and indirectly informed my scholarship, but they're not meetings and events that I've happened upon by chance, right? It feels like I've been very lucky, but these are all because of my language proficiency, and particularly because of my language proficiency in Kazakh. So I've gone longer than I meant to in terms of the time we have scheduled. So I'll end here, but I'm happy to answer any questions in the next 9 minutes or so, 8 minutes. Anybody?
Chris, I'm going to jump in with a question. I think that this is so wonderful to hear you talk about the process that you went through. Can you share some of the tips that for language proficiency specifically? Like when you're working through texts, what kind of tools did you rely on? Some kind of methods. Looking up words in the dictionary or checking something else, like especially when you're trying to digest academic Kazakh, let's say. Any tips on that? Because that's the part I would imagine I struggle with, a lot of others struggle with. If you could touch on that, that'd be super.
And I guess, there isn't a good sort of quick, like here's the easy way to do it answer. And I think the two things, one, where I would say my reading Kazakh especially went from pretty good to I don't want to pat myself on the back too much, pretty good to especially pretty good, was the year of advanced directed language study in Kazakh that I had, and my last year studying Kazakh in Bloomington. It was me and one Kazakh instructor, and we met for I don't remember if it was 2 hours a week or 3 hours a week, but it was backbreaking. I had chanced upon a very well done Kazakh language translation of A Day Lasts Longer Than 100 Years, so Aitmatov's book, which was originally written in Russian, but a extremely well done, very literary translation of that. And so I knew the story because I'd read it in English, but didn't know the Kazakh vocabulary or anything. And we just painstakingly went through that almost line by line. And I'd read, I wish I could say I'd read a chapter in preparation for each lesson. I'd say, I think I read 2 or 3 pages because it was backbreaking. And we would go through and we would answer all of my questions, and we'd get through about half of them and time would be up. But after a year of that, we'd covered so much that, other things just seemed a whole lot more approachable. And then I guess the other in terms of tools, it's been really interesting to see the growth of tools over the last 10 years. When I started, I guess more than 10 years. When I first started studying Kazakh at IU in 2006, there was no online Kazakh to English dictionary or English to Kazakh dictionary. The best dictionary that was available online was Suzduk.kz, which is Kazakh Russian, and it is. I think they're drawing from the definitive Kazakh English dictionary that was compiled in the 30s or so. But anyway, so it was very good. It had pretty much every word that you needed in it. But you might remember that my Russian wasn't really very good in 2006. So I would go from Kazakh to Russian, and if I, maybe a 20% chance that I knew the Russian word, and then for the 80% of Russian words that I didn't know, then from usually looking up in an Oxford Russian dictionary, a paper one, looking it up there, and so it's Kazakh to Russian to English. And I did have a couple from the trip in 2008. I bought every Kazakh English dictionary I could find, and with the 4 that I found, you could sometimes find some of the words you were looking for in them. But now the Google Translate does Kazakh to English, and it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. It was embarrassingly bad when it first came out, and it was fun to put sentences in and see what you got. But it's basically credible now for if you get stuck on a sentence on a newspaper article or something. Basically good. You can't rely on it uncritically, but I would say that that's a pretty solid resource. Otherwise, it's reading and talking as much as you can and taking advantage of the opportunities to do so. And I know I have not done it, but I know that there are I can't remember what it's called, but there's services online that connect you to Kazakh tutors in Kazakhstan for fairly inexpensively on an hourly rate to spend an hour speaking with usually an educated as an English teacher or an English translator person in Kazakhstan, to spend an hour, or also trained in Kazakh. Anyway, I've heard good reports of those online services. I just can't remember the website offhand. Oh, I see a question here. Do you find a big difference between the academic Kazakh and speaking right and the spoken Kazakh? Oh, absolutely. And I think I first realized that as I kind of said about Kyrgyz, where I tested out, and they gave us an actual test at the end of Peace Corps service, and I somewhere in advanced, I don't remember, advanced low, advanced mid, somewhere in there, and I could maybe read like a headline of a newspaper article if it had a picture to go with it that helped me understand the words that were there. So there's absolutely a big difference in terms of, I guess my spoken fluency, I think, is much more kind of informal, or sort of kind of more everyday Kazakh. It's not particularly literary, because I came into Kazakh from a very good base of very colloquial Kyrgyz. So the vocabulary for spoken Kazakh isn't relying as much on I guess the dictionary that I've built, like mental dictionary I built from the more formal study of literature and stuff. In terms of approaching these differences, I guess sort of one of the things that was really tricky, and it kind of gets at your question, was translating my questions of interest into Kazakh that, one, people understood, but two, also reflected what I was trying to ask. And that's where I very much relied on my informants, because I could go from English to perfectly readable Kazakh that wouldn't make sense to somebody that wasn't already familiar with the concepts that I was interested in. So working the presentation of those concepts into terminology that was digestible to an everyday Kazakh person is where I, like I said, I rely very much on the network that I've built in Kazakhstan.
Сәлеметсіз бе, Chris? Sizге үлкен рахмет. Өте қызық болды. So anyway, I was just very curious, what were the texts that you used for Kazakh and Kyrgyz when you were in the Peace Corps?
Okay, I'll answer this question, and I do have to say I have to leave like immediately after this question, because I need to pick up a little one from daycare, and they do not mess around. So in terms of timing, so for Kyrgyz, the only text was a language manual prepared by the Peace Corps staff, and it was it kind of mixed sort of grammar translation with some communicative elements. But it was, I mean, it was internal, and I think I have it around somewhere. I'm not sure if I still do. But there, I think the book was kind of okay. But the language teacher that I had was amazing. He had worked with Peace Corps volunteers for 10 years at that point and had a really good idea of what we needed to know and how to teach it in a way that we understood. And it was very much, you know, kind of communicative competency based, but kind of anchored in the book. Then otherwise for Kyrgyz, I have never worked with a textbook. For Kazakh, what we started with in taking Kazakh at IU, and again, this was in 2006 through 2008, we used the Russian, language manual or language book prepared for Russian speakers in Kazakhstan to learn Kazakh. So it's Bekturov and Bekturova, I think. We use that, and then our language teacher would help us where, you know, where we didn't understand the Russian, which was, as I don't think any of us taking Kazakh had a good background in Russian. So there was a lot of, you know, here's what it's asking you to do. Let's do a practice exercise together, and now you take it home and do the rest. And, you know, it kind of indirectly helps build your Russian competency as well. And then in, trying to think, I have seen but not worked with some introductory Kazakh books that have been published since. I wish I had a better familiarity with them, because I've never worked with them. I've just seen them around, but I think there's 2 or 3 different ones now.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And as I said, and I'm very sorry, but I really, really have to go, or I'm going to get in big trouble.
Sure. Yeah, we'll let you go. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. And I was very glad to have this chance to sit and think about the ways that, you know, I've never really thought about how Kazakh has informed my research, and obviously it has so much. So it was a nice chance to sit and think about that and highlight it for myself in ways that I hadn't done before. So thank you very much for sharing your time with me and letting me tell you stories about my trips to Kazakhstan. And I hope that I'll have the chance to interact with all of you again soon. But I'm really sorry, but I really do have to run. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Chris.
you.
Thank you so much.
Sağ olunuz.